January 1943. The sun rises over the Solomon Islands, burning orange against the restless Pacific waves. On the deck of an American carrier, mechanics dash between sleek blue-painted fighters, the scent of oil and salt thick in the air. Engines roar to life, shaking the steel deck, vibrating through the soles of boots. Above, Japanese reconnaissance planes circle, their pilots squinting through wind-swept goggles, laughter carried over the radio. "Look at those birds," one says, voice light with derision. Clumsy, oversized machines. They'll never match the Zero in the sky. Below, U.S. pilots tighten harnesses, adjusting goggles and gloves, hearts thundering. Not with fear, but anticipation. The F4U Corsair's gull wings glint in the morning sun, a promise of speed and firepower. Pilots exchange quick nods, a silent pact. Survival, victory, retribution. Moments later, the carrier's deck trembles as the Corsairs launch in unison, roaring like predatory beasts over glassy waters. Japanese eyes widen, smiles fading. Within hours, the laughter would turn to disbelief, and the legend of the Corsair would be written in the sky, 1-0 at a time. This day, the Pacific War would witness a shift, one that no overconfident enemy pilot could ignore. The stage is set. The story of the Corsair and the squadrons of Zeros begins. Late 1942, the Pacific War had reached a brutal stalemate. After the shock of Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy had pushed deep into Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific, capturing islands and establishing fortified outposts. The Solomon Islands, a scattered chain of volcanic peaks and coral atolls, had become the next critical battleground. Control of these islands meant control of sea lanes, airfields, and the lifelines of supply routes. For the United States, Guadalcanal was the pivot point, a chance to halt Japanese expansion and begin reclaiming the Pacific. American forces, still reeling from early defeats, poured reinforcements into the theater. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps coordinated a grueling campaign to seize Henderson Field, the strategic airstrip carved into the jungle hills of Guadalcanal. Every landing was contested. Every supply run risked ambush. The men who walked the beaches and patrolled the dense jungles were supported by air power, their eyes in the sky, their shield from enemy dominance. Into this chaos came a new fighter aircraft, the Vought F4U Corsair. Designed to operate from aircraft carriers, it was powerful, fast, and intimidating. Its gull-wing design accommodated a massive engine, giving it unmatched speed and climb for its class. Armament included 650 caliber machine guns, capable of tearing through lightly armored aircraft and delivering devastating strafing runs on ground positions. Yet, the Corsair had a reputation. Difficult to land on carriers, temperamental at low speeds, and initially underestimated by American pilots accustomed to lighter, more agile fighters across the battlefield, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero reigned supreme. Lightweight, highly maneuverable, and armed with two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns, the Zero embodied Japanese aerial doctrine: dominance through agility, precision, and pilot skill. Japanese aviators were trained rigorously, drilled to trust the aircraft as an extension of themselves. The Zero could outturn almost any Allied plane in a dogfight, and early in the war, it had decimated inexperienced American squadrons. Its reputation was nearly untouchable, a lethal shadow over the Pacific. Despite this, the Corsair was entering the war at a crucial moment. U.S. military strategists knew that air superiority would dictate the outcome of naval engagements. The ability to launch strikes from carriers, cover troop landings, and intercept enemy bombers was essential. Guadalcanal's dense jungles and narrow beaches meant that ground forces could not fight in isolation. They depended entirely on air cover. The Corsair's speed, firepower, and range made it ideal for this mission. The strategic situation was tense. American carriers, such as the USS Saratoga and USS Enterprise, were stretched thin, constantly moving to avoid Japanese detection. Japanese naval aviation was equally aggressive, using long-range patrols and skilled pilots to strike Allied positions. Early encounters showed the terrifying effectiveness of both sides, but also exposed weaknesses. American pilots were learning, often through bitter experience, the strengths and limitations of their machines. Japanese pilots, confident from early victories, underestimated the new arrivals, especially the Corsair. By late 1942, the first small squadrons of Corsairs began flying combat missions from Henderson Field and escorting naval operations. At first, Japanese pilots observed them with amusement. The planes seemed oversized, awkward, and clumsy compared to the nimble Zero. Intelligence reports reflected skepticism. The Corsair would be easy prey. Yet every sortie revealed something different. Its engines roared with unmatched power. Its dive speed outstripped the Zero. Its guns, heavy and concentrated, tore through enemy formations with precision. Even before the first full-scale engagements, a tension built in the Pacific skies. Pilots on both sides understood that the coming months would not be like previous encounters. The Zero's agility would meet the Corsair's speed. Japanese confidence would be tested against American ingenuity and industrial might. Each flight over Guadalcanal, over the coral reefs and tangled jungles, carried the potential to rewrite air superiority. This was not a battle of numbers alone. It was a battle of trust, skill, and innovation. The Corsair represented the culmination of American design philosophy, raw power married to tactical flexibility. The Zero represented the embodiment of Japanese doctrine, discipline, maneuverability, and audacious precision. The stage was set. The Pacific skies were about to host a confrontation that would alter the course of the air war and redefine what it meant to dominate in the air. By early 1943, the Guadalcanal campaign had settled into a grueling cycle of attrition. Jungle trails became muddy quagmires under tropical rains. Supply lines were constantly harassed by Japanese naval forces. Both sides were learning harsh lessons. Logistics, pilot endurance, and airfield control mattered as much as raw firepower. For the Americans, every Corsair sortie was a test, not only of the aircraft's performance, but of pilot skill under extreme conditions. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, had grown accustomed to near-total dominance. The Zero's agility and range allowed them to dictate engagements, often forcing opponents into reactive maneuvers. Their training emphasized dogfighting with tight turns and calculated attacks, exploiting the lighter weight of their aircraft. But the war was evolving, and the Pacific skies were changing faster than doctrine could adapt. Reports from early encounters with the Corsair hinted at a troubling reality. This was no ordinary fighter. The Corsair's design, with its powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, allowed for steep dives and rapid acceleration, traits that could turn a fight in seconds. Its wide wingspan and robust airframe made it resilient against damage, unlike the fragile Zero, which could be disabled by a single well-placed burst. However, the aircraft's complexity brought challenges. Carrier landings were perilous due to its long nose and stiff landing gear. Early Marine and Navy pilots had to master these quirks quickly, often learning under fire. American assessments emphasized adaptability. Pilots were trained to avoid turning contests with the Zero, instead relying on boom and zoom tactics, diving from higher altitude, striking with concentrated fire, and climbing back out before the nimble enemy could respond. This contrasted sharply with Japanese expectations. The Zero's pilots, confident in their superior maneuverability, often pursued Corsairs into situations where their agility became irrelevant against sheer speed and firepower. Japanese intelligence underestimated the Corsair. Reconnaissance reports focused on numbers and formation size, missing the technological edge embedded in its design. Overconfidence became a dangerous habit. Many pilots laughed at the big, slow American birds, failing to anticipate the lessons that combat would soon enforce. Meanwhile, American leadership emphasized coordinated strikes and air cover, recognizing that the Corsair could not only defend ground forces but also disrupt enemy operations at sea. The environment itself shaped the air war. Thick clouds and sudden storms over the Solomon Islands forced pilots to make split-second decisions. Dense jungle and jagged reefs meant that mistakes were unforgiving. A pilot downed hundreds of meters offshore faced near certain death or capture. The stakes were high, and each sortie carried the weight of survival, mission success, and the broader campaign's outcome. Despite the challenges, the first engagements hinted at the Corsair's potential. Small skirmishes revealed a troubling pattern for Japanese pilots. Their trusted tactics were no longer guarantees. Corsairs could climb faster, dive harder, and strike with accuracy that Zeros struggled to counter. Early reports of losses, initially dismissed as anomalies, began to accumulate. In squadron briefings, American pilots spoke in measured tones, acknowledging the deadly effectiveness of their aircraft while recognizing the skill required to wield it fully. By now, the stage was set for confrontation. Japanese laughter over the gull-winged fighters faded, replaced by cautious observation. For the Americans, the Corsair symbolized hope, a technological edge capable of offsetting experience and numerical advantage. Soon these planes would cut through Japanese formations, their engines screaming, guns blazing. The balance of power in the skies was shifting, and the coming battles would prove decisive, not only for Guadalcanal, but for the broader trajectory of the Pacific War. From the airfields to the carrier decks, tension coalesced into a single, unavoidable truth. When Corsairs met Zeros, nothing would remain as it had been. For the pilots of the F4U Corsair, each sortie was a battle against both the enemy and their own doubts. The aircraft was powerful, yet temperamental. Its long nose and stiff landing gear demanded precision on carrier decks, leaving little room for error. Marines and Navy aviators, many in their first combat experience, felt the pulse of adrenaline with every launch. Letters home reveal a mix of fear and exhilaration. One pilot described the first climb over Guadalcanal as the sky trembling beneath me, the roar of the engine in my ears, knowing the enemy watches below. Every encounter with the nimble Zero was a test of nerve, skill, and instinct. Japanese pilots, in contrast, entered the theater with confidence forged from victories over earlier Allied forces. The Zero had allowed them to dominate airspace, execute daring maneuvers, and instill fear in every opponent. When they first spotted Corsairs in the distance, laughter often filled the cockpits. Yet beneath that levity, a subtle apprehension grew. Reports of American firepower, dive speed, and tactical coordination began to challenge their assumptions, creating a psychological strain that would intensify with each engagement. The Corsair and the Zero represented contrasting philosophies in aircraft design. The Zero emphasized agility, lightweight, and maneuverability. Its turn radius was deadly, allowing it to outmaneuver most Allied fighters in dogfights. The Corsair, conversely, prioritized raw power, speed, and structural durability. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine enabled dramatic climbs and dives, while its 650 caliber machine guns delivered concentrated, devastating firepower. This technological divergence shaped every encounter. The Corsair could avoid protracted turning engagements, instead diving onto Zeros from above, striking with accuracy and climbing back out of range. The Zero, once confident in its unmatched dogfighting ability, struggled to adapt to the Corsair's boom and zoom tactics. Over time, Japanese intelligence underestimated the implications of this disparity, viewing the Corsair as a clumsy threat, when in fact it would soon dominate skies in raw speed and resilience. naval air operations added another layer of complexity. Corsair pilots often launched from carriers, escorted bombers, or patrolled contested airspace. Takeoff and landing were treacherous, especially on early American carriers not optimized for the aircraft's long landing gear and nose design. Pilots developed techniques to compensate: tail-high approaches, precise throttling, and coordination with deck crews who monitored every move. Japanese tactics, honed in the early war, emphasized aggressive interception and dogfighting. Zero squadrons relied on formation discipline and predictable engagement patterns, assuming superior maneuverability would win the fight. However, these tactics faltered against Corsair formations trained in coordinated climbs, dives, and cross-cover maneuvers. Engagements became battles of positioning and situational awareness. The Corsair's speed and firepower reshaped the tactical environment, forcing Japanese pilots to reconsider their long-held doctrines. Commanders on both sides played crucial roles in shaping air engagements. U.S. Marine Corps leaders like Major Gregory Pappy, Boyington, and naval officers such as Admiral Mark Mitcher understood the Corsair's strengths and vulnerabilities. Orders emphasized altitude advantage, coordination between squadrons, and the judicious use of firepower. Leaders fostered adaptability, knowing that pilot skill combined with technological edge could counter numerical disadvantages. Japanese commanders, including Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and squadron leaders, relied on experience, aggressive engagement, and morale. Yet the unexpected performance of the Corsair disrupted conventional calculations. Decisions had to be made mid-flight, often without complete information, forcing Japanese leadership to reconsider the assumptions that had guided victories for years. Each of these angles, human, technological, tactical, and leadership, intersected in the skies over Guadalcanal. Fear and courage, speed and maneuverability, doctrine and improvisation all collided. The Corsair was not just a machine. It was a pivot around which strategy, morale, and survival revolved. Japanese pilots entered the Pacific Air War with a legacy of victories. Their Zero fighters had become symbols of dominance, inspiring confidence that bordered on arrogance. Early encounters with the Corsair, however, shattered this perception. At first, Japanese aviators mocked the gull-winged aircraft, viewing it as bulky and slow. Reports even described initial engagement attempts as curious exercises, a game against what they considered an inferior opponent. Reality soon proved far harsher. Corsairs, utilizing their superior speed and firepower, inflicted losses that disrupted squadron cohesion. Experienced Japanese pilots found that their usual dogfighting tactics, tight turns and prolonged engagements, were increasingly ineffective. Adaptation became necessary, yet it was hindered by rigid training doctrines and cultural assumptions about air combat. Letters from pilots, preserved in post-war interviews, reveal frustration and disbelief as their expectations collided with an aircraft that refused to behave predictably under traditional maneuvers. The psychological impact of the Corsair was profound. For American pilots, it represented hope, a tangible edge in a theater where survival was never guaranteed. Each successful sortie reinforced confidence, transforming fear into assertiveness. Pilots reported feeling in control for the first time in months, able to dictate the terms of engagement rather than react defensively. This boost in morale extended beyond the cockpit, influencing ground troops who relied on air cover for survival. For Japanese forces, the opposite occurred. Losses inflicted by Corsairs eroded confidence. Units accustomed to easy victories faced the demoralizing reality that superior numbers no longer ensured dominance. As squadron after squadron suffered, the laughter that greeted the first Corsair sightings was replaced by caution, then anxiety. By mid-1943, anecdotal accounts describe pilots hesitating to engage, adjusting formations, and questioning prior tactics, a subtle but powerful shift in the psychology of war. The Corsair forced a re-evaluation of air doctrine on both sides. Its raw speed, heavy armament, and dive capabilities allowed it to redefine the terms of combat. Boom and zoom tactics leveraged these strengths, emphasizing altitude advantage, speed, and hit-and-run strikes. The Zero's traditional turning engagements became liabilities when faced with such a predator. Japanese leaders attempted to adapt. Squadrons experimented with high-speed attacks, tighter formations, and coordinated ambushes. Yet the Corsair's combination of power and resilience rendered many of these adjustments marginally effective. Over time, engagements became a study in contrasts. Raw technological advantage versus finely honed maneuverability. Innovative tactics against rigid doctrine. Calculated risk versus instinctual aggression. The Corsair emerged as a disruptor, forcing every encounter into uncharted tactical territory. American success with the Corsair was not merely a function of the aircraft itself, but of leadership willing to innovate. Commanders encouraged pilots to exploit the plane's strengths, emphasizing coordination, altitude, and fire discipline. Training emphasized adaptation under pressure, teaching aviators to anticipate Japanese reactions and strike decisively. Japanese leadership, however, was constrained by established doctrines and rigid command structures. While individual pilots demonstrated skill and ingenuity, institutional flexibility lagged behind technological change. This disparity between adaptive leadership and rigid hierarchy amplified the Corsair's impact, turning isolated successes into a broader campaign advantage. Every engagement carried profound human consequences. Pilots who underestimated the Corsair often paid with their lives. Those who mastered it became legends. Survivors' accounts detailed the terror of being pursued by a screaming, diving Corsair, the shock of losing squadron mates in seconds, and the quiet resolve required to return to combat after witnessing friends fall. For both Americans and Japanese, the aircraft became more than metal and engines. It became a measure of survival, courage, and fate in the air. These angles together illustrate the multidimensional impact of the Corsair in the Pacific War. Its introduction was not merely a technological event. It reshaped psychology, tactics, leadership decisions, and the human experience of combat. Each factor intertwined, setting the stage for the decisive confrontations to come. August 1943. The skies over the Solomon Islands had grown tense, heavy with anticipation and the roar of engines. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps had refined their use of the F4U Corsair, mastering its quirks, exploiting its speed, and coordinating precise strikes. Japanese pilots, once confident and mocking, now faced a threat that challenged everything they had believed about air combat. The first major engagements were swift and brutal. On a clear morning, Corsair squadrons from Henderson Field took off to intercept Japanese bombers approaching Guadalcanal. Pilots climbed to altitude, scanning the horizon. Within minutes, the enemy was spotted. Formations of Mitsubishi Zeros escorting slow, vulnerable bombers. The Corsairs dived in synchronized waves, unleashing their 650 caliber guns with devastating effect. Accounts from American pilots describe the precision of the strikes. "I fired short bursts," one recalled, and watched the enemy aircraft tumble into the sea, smoke trailing like ribbons across the blue. The Zeros attempted to turn and counterattack, but the Corsair's superior speed and dive capabilities made them elusive targets. Within a single sortie, multiple enemy aircraft were destroyed, and Japanese formations scattered. Japanese reports of these encounters reflect a dawning disbelief. Veteran pilots, accustomed to easy victories, found themselves outmaneuvered despite the Zero's agility. Squadron cohesion broke under the relentless attacks. Letters and post-war interviews revealed the frustration. The Americans knew exactly where to hit. Their planes were fast, their aim deadly, and their tactics unpredictable. the Corsair, had begun to redefine the engagement, turning the skies over Guadalcanal into a theater of calculated destruction rather than instinctual dogfighting. Carrier-based operations amplified the effect. The F-4U's range allowed extended patrols, intercepting enemy aircraft before they could reach strategic targets. On August 21, 1943, a mixed force of Corsairs and Hellcats engaged a large formation of Japanese bombers heading for Allied positions. Pilots coordinated altitude, dive angles, and cross-cover maneuvers, executing what would later be described as textbook air combat. The result was devastating. Multiple bombers destroyed, Zeros downed, and Japanese morale shaken. Tactically, these encounters highlighted the boom and zoom philosophy perfected by American pilots. By avoiding prolonged turning engagements, striking from altitude, and retreating to climb again, Corsairs could inflict maximum damage while minimizing exposure. Zeros, built for dogfighting, struggled to adapt to this new paradigm. The first, sustained losses forced Japanese squadrons to reconsider engagement strategies. Yet adaptation came slowly, hampered by doctrine, pride, and limited intelligence on the Corsairs' capabilities. The human dimension was stark. Pilots on both sides felt the weight of the moment. For Americans, exhilaration mixed with grim awareness. Every kill confirmed the aircraft's potential, but reminded them of the risks of miscalculation. For Japanese aviators, the once familiar skies had become treacherous, and laughter had been replaced by tension and the cold assessment of survival. By late August, the pattern was unmistakable. Corsairs were no longer just tools, they were instruments of psychological and tactical dominance. Japanese pilots now approached engagements with caution, often avoiding direct confrontations or attempting to lure Corsairs into traps that rarely succeeded. The balance of air power in the region was shifting. Guadalcanal, once a contested foothold, was increasingly under the protective shadow of the American fighters. These early engagements marked a turning point. The Corsair had proven that overconfidence could be deadly, and that innovation, training, and technological advantage could redefine air combat. The stage was set for larger battles, where squadrons clashed in numbers and strategy, testing courage, skill, and the very limits of machine and human endurance. September 1943. The Pacific skies were no longer a proving ground. They were a battlefield, defined by the relentless presence of the Corsair. Japanese air forces, now fully aware of the threat, launched larger, more coordinated strikes. Their goal? Disrupt American supply lines, destroy Henderson Field, and restore dominance in the Solomon Islands. Yet every mission encountered the UIU, disciplined, precise, and deadly Corsair formations that had begun to rewrite the rules of aerial combat. On September 12th, a squadron of 16 Corsairs intercepted a Japanese formation of 24 Zeros, escorting bombers bound for the airfield. American pilots climbed to 5,000 feet, forming tight defensive and offensive boxes. As the Japanese closed, Corsairs dived in perfect synchrony, their engines screaming, guns spitting fire. Within minutes, the enemy formation fractured. Bombers were left unprotected. Zeros struggled to respond to attacks from unexpected angles and velocities. By the end of the sortie, 7 enemy aircraft were destroyed, with minimal American losses. Tactical superiority became evident. The Corsair's speed, climb rate, and armament allowed pilots to dictate the terms of engagement. Pilots perfected maneuvers designed to exploit weaknesses in the Zero. Diving attacks from higher altitudes, hit-and-run strafing, and coordinated wing cover strategies. The aircraft's structural durability meant it could absorb return fire that would cripple lighter fighters, allowing pilots to press attacks with confidence. Each encounter reinforced a new reality. The Corsair was more than a plane. It was a weapon that reshaped aerial doctrine. Japanese pilots attempted adaptation, but the shift came too slowly. Training and experience emphasized maneuverability and dogfighting, and many were unprepared for an opponent that refused to engage in the expected patterns. Some units tried high-speed interceptions or multi-angle approaches, but the Corsair's firepower and speed repeatedly outclassed them. Reports from surviving Japanese pilots describe mounting frustration and disbelief. The aircraft they had once considered inferior now dominated every encounter. The human dimension intensified. American pilots developed an almost instinctual understanding of how to exploit the Corsair's advantages, while Japanese aviators experienced the psychological toll of repeated failures. Letters and post-war memoirs describe the moment when hope of easy victory evaporated. We realized the Corsair was not just another fighter. It hunted us, it struck with precision, and we could not touch it. Morale shifted in the air as decisively as the machines themselves. The scale of these engagements expanded. By mid-September, squadrons of Corsairs conducted multiple sorties daily, escorting bombers, providing close air support, and engaging enemy fighters. Each day, more Zeros were destroyed, each engagement reinforcing the aircraft's reputation. Guadalcanal was no longer merely defended, it was increasingly secure, and the Japanese were forced to reconsider offensive plans that once relied on the assumption of air superiority. A pivotal moment occurred during a large-scale engagement over New Georgia. Approximately 40 Corsairs intercepted a Japanese strike force of nearly 60 aircraft. The fight lasted over 30 minutes, stretching across sunlit skies and cloud shadows. Despite numerical inferiority, American pilots leveraged altitude advantage, coordinated attacks, and boom and zoom tactics to devastating effect. Observers later recorded that the Japanese lost nearly a quarter of their attacking force, with pilots retreating in disarray. For the Americans, it was validation. The Corsair had proven its capacity to dominate, even against superior numbers. Strategically, the implications were profound. The Corsair forced the Japanese Navy to reevaluate not only tactics, but broader operational assumptions. Air superiority, once taken for granted, now required meticulous planning, intelligence, and respect for the capabilities of the American fighter. Guadalcanal's skies became a proving ground for aerial innovation, shaping how both sides would approach the Pacific Air War in the months and years to follow. By the end of September, a clear pattern had emerged. The Corsair was no longer the clumsy bird Japanese pilots had mocked. It was the apex predator of the Solomon Islands skies. Its combination of speed, firepower, and tactical flexibility had turned the tide of air engagements, forcing the Japanese to acknowledge a new reality. Underestimating this aircraft could no longer be tolerated. The decisive phase of the Corsair's Saofu introduction had ended, but its influence would echo through every subsequent battle. The balance of air power had shifted, not by numbers alone, but through innovation, courage, and the lethal integration of man and machine. The Pacific War had witnessed a turning point, written in smoke trails and the shattered wings of Zeros, signaling a new era in which American pilots and their Corsairs would dominate the skies. By late 1943, the consequences of the Corsair's emergence were unmistakable. Japanese air forces had suffered mounting losses over Guadalcanal and the surrounding Solomons. Their squadrons diminished in both numbers and morale. The Zero, once considered the pinnacle of aerial design, was being systematically countered. American pilots, trained to exploit the Corsair's advantages, inflicted losses at a pace that Japanese commanders struggled to replace. Operational reports from the period detail the scale of the shift. In multiple engagements, American forces destroyed significant portions of attacking formations, often with minimal losses to their own ranks. For instance, during the September New Georgia sorties, U.S. Corsairs downed nearly a quarter of a Japanese strike force, while losing only a handful of aircraft. These ratios, repeated over successive missions, eroded the Japanese ability to project power in the region. The human cost was profound. For Japanese pilots, each defeat was a psychological blow as much as a tactical one. Experienced aviators, once confident in their ability to dominate the air, faced the terrifying reality of a machine and tactics that outmatched them. Survivors recounted the fear of pursuing Corsairs, the disorientation in dives and climbs, and the helplessness when their squadron mates were torn from formation by American fire. Letters and post-war interviews describe a growing tension. The realization that victory was no longer guaranteed, that overconfidence could be fatal. American pilots, conversely, gained a surge of morale. The Corsair became a symbol of innovation, skill, and survival. Veteran flyers developed reputations not merely for bravery, but for mastering the aircraft's unique capabilities. Coordination between squadrons improved, each sortie refining techniques and building confidence. Ground troops and naval personnel recognized the Corsair's protective role, knowing that air superiority could mean the difference between holding Guadalcanal or retreating under fire. Strategically, the Corsair's impact extended beyond individual engagements. Its ability to maintain dominance in the air allowed American forces to operate with greater freedom, secure supply lines, and conduct offensive missions against Japanese positions. The Japanese Navy, constrained by losses and the need to preserve pilots, began to reconsider offensive operations. Their air doctrine, previously reliant on agility and audacity, was forced to confront the harsh realities of technological superiority and tactical innovation. Logistical considerations amplified these effects. Replacing lost aircraft and trained pilots proved difficult for Japan. Each Corsair victory removed a zero from the equation permanently, while U.S. production lines, already running at full capacity, ensured a steady supply of replacement fighters. This disparity underscored a broader strategic shift. The combination of technological advancement, pilot training, and industrial output increasingly favored the Allies. The psychological landscape of the Pacific Air War had transformed. Laughter that once greeted the Corsair was gone. Japanese pilots approached engagements with caution, hesitation, and respect for a foe they had previously underestimated. American forces, emboldened by repeated successes, approached each sortie with confidence and clarity. This shift, subtle yet decisive, set the conditions for the broader air campaigns that would follow in 1944 and beyond. The impact of the Corsair was not limited to immediate battles. It redefined expectations of fighter performance, pilot training, and tactical doctrine. Its presence forced both sides to adapt, innovate, and reconsider what it meant to control the skies over the Pacific. The stage was set for further evolution of air warfare, with the lessons learned over Guadalcanal shaping strategies across the theater. As 1943 progressed, the broader consequences of the Corsair's introduction became increasingly apparent. Japanese air operations over the Solomon Islands were significantly disrupted. Experienced pilots had been lost, and replacement training could not keep pace with attrition. Squadrons once lauded for precision and effectiveness were now fragmented, forced into defensive maneuvers and hesitant engagements. Guadalcanal, once a contested foothold, remained firmly in Allied hands, largely due to the sustained air superiority provided by Corsairs. Numbers tell a stark story. During the peak months of engagement, U.S. forces reported dozens of Zeros destroyed in sorties from Henderson Field alone, while American losses remained comparatively low. For Japan, these losses were magnified by the difficulty of training and deploying new pilots, combined with the psychological strain of facing an aircraft that consistently outperformed expectations. Historical accounts note that entire Japanese squadrons hesitated to engage, reorganized formations multiple times mid-flight, or abandoned attacks entirely when confronted by Corsair patrols. Strategically, The Corsair shifted the calculus of Pacific warfare. Control of the skies enabled American forces to conduct offensive operations with greater confidence, support ground troops more effectively, and maintain crucial supply lines. Guadalcanal became a launch point for subsequent operations, as the secure airfield allowed bombers and fighters to reach deeper into Japanese-held territory. Japanese commanders, recognizing the growing imbalance, were forced to conserve resources and reallocate forces to protect remaining holdings rather than pressing offensive campaigns. The Corsair also influenced future aircraft design and tactical thinking. Its success demonstrated the value of combining raw power, durability, and speed, while highlighting the limitations of agility-focused designs like the Zero, in a context where technological innovation and tactical flexibility could dominate. U.S. leaders took these lessons into account, shaping future fighter development, pilot training, and combat doctrine across the Pacific theater. Morale, both on land and at sea, was transformed. American pilots felt a sense of control and capability that had been rare in earlier stages of the war. Ground troops relied on Corsair patrols for protection during operations on exposed beaches and jungle airstrips. Conversely, Japanese forces experienced the cumulative effects of repeated failure. Reports describe growing caution among pilots, reluctance to engage, and a recognition that earlier assumptions about air superiority were no longer valid. The psychological edge that had long favored Japan had shifted decisively. In the months following these pivotal engagements, the Corsair established itself as a defining presence in the Pacific Air War. Its influence extended beyond mere numbers or victories. It reshaped operational planning, tactics, and the very mindset of pilots on both sides. Japanese forces learned, often painfully, that underestimating the Corsair carried consequences that could not be ignored. By the end of 1943, the Corsair had not only altered the course of battles over the Solomon Islands, but had set a precedent for air combat in the Pacific. The aircraft had proven that technological innovation, when paired with effective training and leadership, could decisively shift the balance of power. Guadalcanal stood as a testament to this transformation, a strategic victory made possible by the mastery of both machine and man in the unforgiving skies above the Pacific. The story of the Corsair's triumph over the Zeros would ripple through history, influencing strategies, aircraft development, and pilot training for years to come. Its legacy was more than tactical. It was a turning point in the understanding of air superiority, proving that innovation, courage, and adaptability could redefine the rules of warfare. The tale of the Corsair over the Solomon Islands is more than a story of machines and maneuvers. It is a story of adaptation, courage, and the intersection of human will with technological innovation. In the early days, Japanese pilots had laughed at the gull-winged fighters, confident that agility and skill alone would ensure dominance. Yet the Corsair demanded respect, reshaping assumptions, strategies, and the very psychology of aerial combat. It was a lesson in evolution under fire. Pilots learned to trust both their instincts and their machines, understanding that victory depended as much on preparation, coordination, and tactical insight as on raw skill. The Zeros, once symbols of near invincibility, encountered the limits of doctrine when faced with an opponent that exploited speed, power, and resilience. The human cost of this lesson was steep, etched into letters, memoirs, and reports that tell of fear, exhilaration, and the quiet resolve required to survive in the skies. Beyond individual engagements, the Corsair's impact was strategic and symbolic. It allowed Allied forces to secure vital positions, protect supply lines, and mount offensive operations with confidence. It demonstrated the growing importance of technology, training, and adaptability in modern warfare. The aircraft became a pivot point, a tangible embodiment of the United States' ability to innovate under pressure and leverage industrial strength to shift the balance of power. Perhaps most profoundly, The Corsair story reminds us that underestimating an opponent can be fatal. Overconfidence, once a source of pride, was replaced by caution and respect. War, in its relentless logic, punishes assumptions and rewards preparation, adaptability, and ingenuity. In this sense, the Corsair was not merely a plane, it was a teacher, etching lessons into the sky and into history itself. The Pacific War continued, battles raged, and technologies evolved. Yet the legend of the Corsair remained, a testament to the moment when courage met innovation and changed the course of conflict. In the end, it was a reminder that dominance is earned, not assumed, and that even the laughter of overconfidence can be silenced by skill, foresight, and the roar of engines in the morning sun. This was the legacy of the Corsair, the fighter that laughed last,